Good evening. I said last week that instead of Lectio Divina for this week and the following week, that instead I would do a talk about the Eucharist, about our return to Mass after lockdown, and also to look at the question of the resumption of communion under both kinds. I'm calling both talks Straddling the Divide, because I think it's quite a good idea for us just to reflect a little bit on how things were before and how they are now, and what a wake-up call we had when the pandemic started and lockdown was imposed. Because I think it has changed the shape of parish life, I think in some ways positively, but I think there are just one or two things we need to be aware of for our future. So bear with me. This is going to be a little bit longer than Lectio Divina, so stay with me if you feel able to. But I'll divide the talk into two parts. Let me start by a comment from Pope Francis. He observed that we're not living in an era of change, but in a change of era. And he was referring to the digital revolution that's changed everything, as our experience of lockdown made very clear. Within the church, new possibilities are there to be seized for walking together, growing in unity, and reaching out. Pope Francis also acknowledged the value of live streaming, but he added that though we may be there in real time, can we honestly say that it's a real presence? He warned us that it's okay for the time being in order to get through the tunnel, but he stressed the importance of physical presence and touch. I think though we're largely out of the wood, we're not quite there yet. Our attendance in this parish, at least, is more or less, but not quite back to where it was before lockdown. And I want us to reflect on this a little bit, not in any kind of telling off way or hectoring, but just to see where we're all coming from. The virtual world, with all its sophistication, can, Pope Francis said, have desensitizing effects on us when we experience things through the screen of a device like a laptop or of a TV screen. It's not quite the same as being physically present. And I think there's a very good kind of parallel, and that's with attendance at sports events. We may be the most devoted followers of a particular football, rugby, or cricket team, or devoted followers of tennis, and we're delighted that we've got armchair coverage of the big match. But the question is, does that really compare with the roar of the crowd in the stadium, the jumping up and down on the terrace, the pie and the pint at half time? We may feel we're better off sitting in our armchair, but I think you'll appreciate what I'm saying, that there is a difference between watching from a distance in which you have not the same opportunity to be caught up in the crowd and looking from the comfort of your own armchair. Now, when the first and strictest lockdown of the pandemic was imminent, I'd been at a clergy meeting where one of our priests had been talking about live streaming masses when our churches were closed. To be honest, the thought had never occurred to me, but I knew that it made sense. I wondered how easy it would be to set up. How much would it cost? would I, in a small parish, be able to get it going, particularly if lockdown was in force? And as a definite non-techie, would I need outside professional help? And this priest said, you just need a webcam and a tripod. Plug it into the computer and you're away. I wondered, could it be as simple as that? But it was. So, with great haste, after the meeting, one of my fellow priests and myself headed to the nearest branch of Curry's. Other electrical stores are available, only to discover that they'd sold the last webcam that morning. Nonetheless, I inquired one quite quickly, but soon realised that the Wi-Fi from my house didn't reach the church. So, as many of you will remember, as an interim measure, I began celebrating the Eucharist alone in the stairwell of my house. In 50 years of ministry, I had never before said Mass without at least one person being present. And the initial experience was, to say the least, rather weird. In truth, it didn't instinctively feel right, because there was no one to respond to the greeting or join in the penitential act. I proclaimed the scripture readings to the front door. I consecrated bread and wine for no one but myself, which made the invitation to communion seem rather hollow, since it was one that could not be taken up by anybody bar me. And the dismissal at the end of the Mass was, at best, to people who wouldn't be moving from their lounge because there was nowhere for them to go. The anomalies and pitfalls of this kind of celebration made me appreciate why, under normal circumstances, the Roman Missal has always directed that at least one other person should be present, even in what the Missal describes as a Mass without a congregation. Clearly, adaptations that had made sense had to come into play quite quickly. Parallel to the live stream, you'll remember that I sent out a daily thought to parishioners online, and soon the feedback began to flow in. I was quite rightly taken to task by one couple who said they wished I wouldn't refer to those who were joining me via live stream. Please, they said, welcome those who are participating in the Mass. Because while what you're doing may seem strange from your end, my wife and I are joining in the responses, the Gloria and the Creed, and discussing your homily like never before. What had seemed like an interim measure was rapidly becoming something of a fixture. More people were watching than coming to Mass on a normal Sunday. And places like the National Shrine at Walsingham and our cathedral and other larger churches were recording viewers in thousands rather than hundreds. But there's one caveat. We should always be wary of those kind of figures, because they include those who may have just watched a short snippet, as well as those who are there for the whole Mass. You know, it's not quite so easy to pop into Mass for 5 minutes and then leave because we don't like the singing or because the homily is going on beyond its appointed time. So, almost overnight, though Masses had been live streamed for the housebound by a number of enterprising parishes for some time, this was a different kind of housebound. Not a housebound where everybody was confined to bed or to chairs, but frustratingly incarcerated. And in the Catholic Church, although priests were not forbidden to go into their churches, there was for about 4 months no access for anybody else. But once our churches were open once more for the celebration of Mass, to which all who felt able were welcome to attend, live stream became something different again. But before we look at that, let's go back to the pre-pandemic church. There's a great danger of it sounding like a pre- and post-Reformation. We tend to look back on 2019 as being normal. And yes, it was in terms of there being no restrictions. But when we start to compare church-going figures in the post-pandemic church, whether they're good or not so good, 2019 is seen as a kind of yardstick. That's why we talk about being back to normal or not quite there. Before we can begin to look at the church in 2022 and in its future, 2023 and its future, I think we need to look at our past. 2019 was what we remember, the year when everything was normal, the last year when many of us went on holiday, the last time before 2022 that our churches were able to celebrate the Triduum and Holy Week, the last year that the only people who seemed to wear masks in the street were tourists from abroad. Yes, that was normal, but was it all good? 2019 was a year that was on a continuing downward spiral in terms of both church membership and church attendance across the board. And a regular faith survey carried out by a consultancy showed that between 1980 and 2015, among other things, the following had happened. By 2015, 28% of the population only said they believed in God or in a higher spiritual power. 38% did not believe in God or a higher spiritual power, and 20% believed in some kind of spiritual power only, and 14% were unsure about either. It's been estimated that by 2025, membership of churches in England will be no more than 2.5 million, or just over 4% of the population. The greatest decline is in the Church of England and the Catholic Church, while Orthodox, Pentecostal, and new churches, evangelical and charismatic and house churches, are growing. Of the 4 UK countries, England had the lowest percentage of the population attending church, just 4.7% in 2015, with Anglicans and Catholics both showing similar attendances. The UK is currently the 29th most religious out of 34 European countries, only ranking above Belgium, Sweden, the Czech Republic, Denmark, and Estonia. And with the exception of Portugal, all of the 10 most religious countries in Europe are in Eastern Europe, with the Romanians topping the poll. So 2019 was not halcyon days. Decline had accelerated over many years, but especially in the 21st century. And I suspect that many of us were in denial. The pre-Brexit influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe and elsewhere had certainly kept our numbers up, and they were on the increase, at least technically. So not being able to go to church was in truth for some people perhaps something of a relief. And for the churches, it did give us a curious wake-up call. And part of that wake-up call was that if we were to be in touch with anybody when our doors were closed, how could we reach out? And there is some evidence that online church did result in reaching out to the unchurched, as well as those who were simply confined to barracks. But online meant different things in different traditions. For Catholics and for many Anglicans, Eucharist is the normal yardstick for worship. And so without communion available to everybody, live stream was either seen as the best possible option, or it was seen as being deficient in many regards, not least in gathering together with others. But lockdown gave rise to a teaching ministry that was perhaps less evident before, in the forms of things like Lectio Divina, online retreats, other kinds of worship. But for people from a free church or Pentecostal background, the inability to gather together and sing was the greatest deprivation. A Methodist friend of mine remarked, "You need to remember that we were born in song." And even after churches were allowed to reopen, the prohibition of singing resulted in the delay for many of the free churches being much longer. And online worship for them was very often a recorded compilation of music, prayer, and preaching. So perhaps the lockdown taught all Christians to examine what really mattered to them and what they really understood the word church to mean. We can all say that the church is primarily about the people who belong and who gather for worship, rather than the building that's used. But when the building is not open to bring worshippers together, then the notion of a worshipping community is most certainly weakened. And for some churches, the doors have not reopened for worship, and some have indeed finally closed their doors. I think this sudden jolt at a few days' notice, and we didn't have much notice, you'll remember, before the first lockdown, may have revealed some of the chinks in the armour of faith. That we may not have noticed. But I think we need to ask what the rapid decline in the last 20 years is really about. It seems to me to be simplistic to say that it's to do with loss of faith. Perhaps a parallel symptom was that gathering together seemed to be offering less and less to a spiritually hungry world. Perhaps our decline was connected with the tendency to be handing out stones and scorpions and snakes when people were looking for something more nourishing, like eggs and bread and fish. My experience at a personal level during the Easter season of 2020, when I was saying Mass alone and reading the Acts of the Apostles every day aloud, but only hearing it myself, made me realize just how little I had listened to or taken in that marvelous unfolding of the church's early life over the years. It was a wake-up call to myself and perhaps to other pastors. What have we been missing? What have we failed to give to others by our own inattentiveness? From the confines of our own homes or our own closed-down buildings, we were challenged to become curiously more outward-looking, instead of hoping that our church attendance would keep up or increase, or that the decline could be halted. We firstly had a duty to keep in touch with those who valued their Sunday celebration. Complaints about parish clergy who did nothing other than succumb to the lockdown themselves. The problem of redirecting people to watch online a church that had the equipment and therefore deprived people of what mattered, some sort of contact with their own priest, people, and community. And when reopening was possible, what happened to those people who had no physical space to worship in? And what about those who are not computer literate and have no means of accessing YouTube or whatever platform is used? But live stream does continue to make a difference, and it will continue to be a valuable lifeline for those who are more or less permanently household. And like it or not, we have online parishioners who don't deserve to be treated as second class. And that's why the wake-up call to me about referring to those who participate was and is an important reminder that for many who are watching at home, it is the only way in which they have contact with the community of faith. And had we not had lockdown, would I, for one, have been offering live stream? I doubt it, but I'm glad that it happened. It's still an interim measure for a few people who remain cautious or afraid. And it's become the sort of halfway house between coming to church and not coming to church for those who are there, as and when they choose to, as well as for the inquirers whose appetite might well be whetted. It's a way of making contact that's new to us. And instead of scrapping it because we're back to normal, we need to see it as a valuable tool of evangelization. So I'm going to stop there and I'll finish off this talk with a little bit about communion under both kinds and return to it in next week. But thank you for bearing with me today. I hope it's perhaps prompted a few thoughts in your own minds, and I hope it's in some way been helpful to what the nature of worship is really about. So until I'm with you again, I can't use that phrase until I see you again, because that's not what live stream or television is about. But until we're online again, good night and God bless.